Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm excited today to talk to Rob Osler about the case of the missing maid, and I am joined today also by DM Rowell. Donna and I will both be asking Rob questions about his latest book. Welcome, both of you.
Hello.
Thank you. Good to see you both.
Thank you. Good to have you here. Rob, will you give the audience an overview about what your latest book is about?
I'd be happy to. So again, it's The Case of the Missing Maid. It's book one in a new historical series set in Chicago in America's progressive age, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the series title is Harriett Marrow Investigates, and she zooms around town. I'm going to show you the cover because I think it's so gorgeous. But there's Harriet on her trusty Victoria Overman bicycle racing around Chicago. The setting is 1898. The progressive era in America is pretty much set at 1890 to 1920, and we can talk more about that if that's of interest. But it's the progressive era, Chicago, female detective, and the book begins page one with her arriving to her new job at the Prescott Detective Agency. It's a fictional agency, but it is modeled in parts on the famous Pinkerton's agency, which was also headquartered in Chicago. Much bigger, much more questionable reputation at the time because they were a lot of hired thugs to break unions and things, but that's another story. And so again, the story starts in chapter one, page one, with her arriving at the agency, and then all the people, aside from the principal, Theodore Prescott, whose name is on the door on the agency, are all certain that she's there as a secretary because they don't have any women detectives until Harriet arrives.
So what made you go with a female lead this time rather than a male? Because you could have had a male in this story. I, of course, love the fact that it's a female, but what made you decide on a female rather than a male?
Yeah. So the character's name is Harriett Marrow. I was born and raised by a single mom and then my sister. So that our household was my single mom and my sister. The other two prominent women in my life were Aunt Vera Marrow, and my grandmother, Harriet Pruitt. So Harriet Pruitt is the name. And then the character inspiration, although my mom was not a lesbian, is just the spirit of we're doing it. You know, whether it was like sending me to college or buying me skis or, whatever it was, that spirit of, oh no, we're going to make that happen. So it's that spirit of independent women. And it just happens that it's coming from a gay man opposed to a woman, because that is still my lived experience. And, as long as I can remember, through my 20s, through my 30s, Aunt Vera lived to 103. So, it was in my life, a long time. These were the women. And so also it's like, I've got a long-winded response to this, so I'll cut it short. But also through junior high and high school, it wasn't until my senior year that I had a guy best friend. I always had girl best friends, but not girlfriends for obvious reasons. Although there was a period where I was like, shouldn't I? So it was honestly natural to write a woman character because so much of my life was surrounded by women characters, far more than straight men, and far more than gay men, because growing up in Boise, Idaho, it's like there was not one single gay man to model, or to look at and go, oh, is that really a thing? Is that okay? And, this was years before Will and Grace, or or anything else, or Troye Sivan. There was none of that where you could, see yourself in some respect reflected back to you as okay. So that's a long-winded answer, but it's like that's why she's female, because it's like that's more my world in many respects.
I have to say your spirit and your intent absolutely comes through. There is nothing but respect in the character you put her, and I love the era you put her in as well, because you do have one gay man character in the book, which I thought was wonderful that you put it in there, because also I'm sure you're going to start exploring how women got to be gay or tender to each other much more than men ever got to be. It's just such a perfect time period that you've got this whole female detective going with. What made you choose that era? I know it's the progressive, but why then?
Yeah, so this is another long story. I'll try to edit it down.
Take all the time you need, Rob. We're here for it.
The original book that I wrote with Harriet as the featured protagonist was called Murder at the Nat, and it was set in Boise, Idaho, because it was all around the place of this natatorium, which was this palace of a swimming pavilion. It's incredible. Long gone. It blew down in a windstorm because it was made of timber, and it was a heated pool facility, so all the wood rotted. The point of that seeming digression is, it really started with a particular building as so perfect for a murder mystery. So that pulled it back in time to when the building existed. Then there's a whole story about, how this book came to be published, because it was set in Boise. And so then the editor at Kensington, who is the publisher of the series, and John Scognamiglio, the editor there, said, I'm not sure we can buy this, but before you send her off to an exotic location, and I'll never forget those words, exotic, because it makes me chuckle, having been born and raised in Boise. The New Yorker calling Boise, Idaho in the turn of the century exotic location. Rewind, have her start out as a new, fresh detective in Chicago, maybe play with the relationship with Prescott as her mentor and establish that. So, fast forward, that's where we're at. I will say, Donna, it just then happened with that time frame, which was the progressive era. And truth be told, I haven't confessed this to anybody. It was actually the publisher at Kensington, through John, who said, when I got offered the book deal, and we love the idea of this character in the progressive era. And I'm like, is it the progressive era? Is that? And so then I did a lot of research on the progressive era. And the fascinating thing about the progressive era is, post-industrial revolution. So the middle class was just starting to have the means and the privilege, if you will, to be able to look right and left across society and go, we got these things called tenements, and they're terrible. We have terrible working conditions. We have children at the age of 8 in coal mines. We have social injustice. Women don't have the vote. Black men are supposed to have the vote from the 15th Amendment, but they don't really, because of all the laws that, the South put in place to, for like grandfather clauses and all sorts of things. Wow, we have terrible working conditions, and the Pinkerton agents are being employed to come club our, union-seeking, laborers who have deplorable working conditions and low wages. It's such a fascinating lens to view current society through 1898, because, as I said at the Midwest Mystery Conference, a plug there for that great conference in Chicago, you can think of like, union busting. Well, that was at the turn of the century before the last turn of the century, right? But it's like, hello, Amazon and Starbucks. You can think about voting suppression, and women have the right to vote. And then you think of, things that are happening now in certain states, trying to make it, harder for people to vote. You can think of, certainly we don't have children in coal mines at the, at the age of 8 or 12 or 14. It's like, oh, what about those packaged good plants? Not that long ago that were in the news that, they contract with another entity who contracts with another entity, and they're scooping up miners to work in harsh labor conditions, after hours. So I say this a lot. I talk about this extensively, actually, in the author's note, which is pretty lengthy at the back of the book, that it's an interesting lens to view today's struggles and to acknowledge how far we've come, but also how far we have to go. And if it was contemporary, I'd have to take a very different sensibility to those issues, because it would come across as very, very strident, very lecturing. But Harriet's just out there like observing, right? And so that distance of 126 years, I think, gives me in many ways more latitude to bring up these social issues, because, hey, it's just a historical. I'm just saying what it was, and I don't have to get into a contemporary tussle with what is your opinion on this. It's historical enough where it can be considered facts.
And relevant, so relevant to the time period. You're absolutely right.
I think the relevance is one of the things that got me the most, because for all the things that have changed, there's still things that haven't changed. One of the terms that came to mind was hiding in plain sight. We've all gay LGBTQ plus people have always been here, but there has been, and sometimes maybe even today, this idea of hiding in plain sight. I think during the progressive era, and maybe even until the 60s, we noticed things about other people. We usually just kept our mouth shut. Nowadays, with social media, people don't seem to be able to have a filter about anything. So I do agree with you that setting it, 126 years ago, the greatest thing about that is it gives you the opportunity to point out what's still screwed up in this world today without beating us over the head with a hammer.
Yeah. And the reader can draw those inferences, right? And like, look at that and go, she was battling that, or, the progressives, and she was attentive to those issues. I think we've got that still going on. I'm letting the reader,
Well, I totally agree. And I think there again, as I said, that's the beauty and maybe even a little bit of the heartbreak of how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
Yeah.
One of the things that you have with a historical, one of the beautiful things you have is the ability for your characters to say things that we all recognize as being accepted. For instance, there's a reference to two single women living together who even at a young age are already called spinsters, because we don't want to know what's going on in the bedroom. We understand they're living together, probably not just for economical issues. The county I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, in the 80s, late 70s and early 80s, the woman who was the superintendent of our public schools was a lesbian, and she lived with her partner. Now, they had both been school teachers, and they were both spinsters. And I found it to be, and I will say that Ruth Hoyle probably would never, ever be the superintendent of public schools in the county I grew up in today's world, because because people looked at them as spinsters, and because they'd been teachers, they were harmless. Nowadays, people would look at them under the microscope of, these are two lesbians, and what are they going to do to our children? That's where I think that some of the issues you bring up in this book, we have not tackled. This country has not rounded the right corner. Social media is not helping.
Yeah. It's interesting just in terms of that hiding in plain sight. One of the real challenges with the research on this book, finding out, was there the L train in Chicago? That takes a moment. You can figure that out. How far was it built out? You can figure that out. What was life, now jumping to a much bigger relevant topic to the book, what was life like for either Harriet, or you mentioned her friend, her colleague, who's certainly not out, no one was, the gay man in the story, Matthew McCabe. What was their life like in 1898 Chicago, from a social perspective? How did they find love interests, romantic partner? How did that work? Where did they socialize? You tell me. It is really, really tough. It's largely accepted, although there's some debate. There's good debate about everything. That LGBTQ plus rights really, really started with kind of Stonewall, and then forward. There's a lot of scholarship. There's a lot of memoir. There's a lot of everything from World War II up. In 1898, what was life like for a lesbian in a big city or a small? I mean, just like what was life like? One of the curious things is even just the term lesbian, queer, homosexual, gay, they didn't really exist in the public vernacular. In fact, the whole concept of being a lesbian or a gay man and especially a lesbian, were so far outside the general public consciousness that it wasn't a thing. So Dan, when you say hiding in plain sight, so much so that the whole notion of a queer individual wasn't even a thing. I mean, blacks were oppressed and then some, but they were visual. I mean, you could identify them. Even if a man was, like a Nancy or some of those silly terms of the time, you just as you say, you would look past it because it was just like no one knew anyone gay because no one was out. No one knew anyone lesbian because no one was out. You bring up some terms like spinster, and there's the famous Boston marriages, but you could look past them, even though I'm sure people were very suspicious because, that just poor thing, she couldn't find a husband, so she moved in with this other lady who, poor thing, couldn't find a husband, and for economic and friendship reasons, they lived together. Who cares? Or even romantic friendships were very much a common phase of life for young women. From like 18, for your majority of 18 to like 22, you could walk around, you could hold hands, you could even exchange like kisses on the cheek. That was just girls being girls, and it's just a phase, right? So you could hide in plain sight in those respects. For women, I'm sorry. Then jumping over for men, it was more of an anathema, in that if you did find out there were perversion laws, there weren't even really the laws, because I've looked back at like what those laws were in Chicago, and they were around perversion. They weren't about homosexuality because the word really wasn't in the vernacular. Now I'm jumping all over, but I want to jump back because one of the most fascinating things about lesbianism, if you will, was that term. You can find the term, but it's predominantly in academia or in psychology, among psychiatrists and writing papers and studying this aberration. And the two most frequent explanations for lesbian are, one, well, that is either a masculine woman, and a pervertedly masculine woman taking advantage of a weak and feeble-minded one, or it is two prostitutes doing woman and woman sex for the pleasure of the male customer. So in both cases, I think this is just so like, of course, men, come on. At the heart of lesbianism, their explanation was either a masculine like woman or for the entertainment of a man. In both cases, these straight men were explaining this, aberration of lesbianism because of either the masculine or the man. What it's like, it's not about you guys. It's not always about you. And I just think that's, yes, that's, there you go.
The history we've lived is so interesting. I'm so lucky and glad that I only had to love in fear for a small period of my life.
Right.
And then after that, I, was out. The moment I decided to have a child, it was, I'm out, and I am not going to give him anything to be ashamed of. I love the period of time I got to grow up in because I got to choose to be out. Um, it's so depressing in so many ways. Well, it's wonderful. And I look at my son's generation and I'm listening through his high school period, and sexuality is fluid in so many of their minds. And I love that aspect. And I never would have thought, my son's now in his 30s, that there would be a boomerang. And to hear some people being discriminating about being gay or lesbian, I never thought we would take a step backwards. So I'm forcing us forward. The more people that see that we're in the world and that we raise families, we love, we live just like everybody else, the better for it. And I think the history you bring out in Harriet is something we all need to know. I think in some ways, there's a whole generation that don't realize how much of a secret it had to be, and that you could lose your life over who you love.
Oh. Yeah, I know we're talking about book 1. I'm just going to slip in something crazily enough about book 3, just because it's lurking behind this screen. I'm almost done with the draft. In that I take that on more because basically people are never going to remember this like 3 years from now when that third book comes out. But basically Matthew has a love interest who is, gets put in jail, and so I am able to like take on different slices, as I kind of move from book to book. And it's like, all right, I'm going to take a look at tenements in book 2, and settlement houses a little more. And then book 3, I'm going to look at, corruption a little more and, police and that kind of thing. So yeah. I mean, it still comes around to like better, I'd rather be a gay man today than I would in 1898.
All of us. Yes.
But that, but that doesn't mean that, any LGBTQ plus person lives an unfettered, truly equal life and is viewed by society, is not viewed in society at large in ways that are constantly othering. And, unless you are, I think, a person of color, or you're a LGBTQ plus person, queer person, somehow identifying, or disabled, or whatever your difference is, it's hard to appreciate how often you're othered. And it's, and it usually is in like subtle ways that people, it's like, you're just like, did you ever just realize what you said? And the answer is no. And it's usually like, if you could see their thought bubble, it'd be like, they just skimmed right across that. And it, and then it's like, okay, do I like go, hey, I have done that before. I've gotten more bold like you, Donna. It's like, as you get older, you're just like, hold up, wait,
right?
I don't think you meant that, but here's what I heard,
All right. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to share a story with you. I was getting a shower in preparation for this interview so you wouldn't smell me, so I'd look decent. And I just laughed out loud because I thought about this time a few years ago when I went to Salt Lake City, and I was there for a half marathon, and I was renting a car, and the woman at the car agency said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to do a half marathon." And she's like, "And what are you going to do?" And I'm like, "It's Sunday. And what are you going to do today?" And I said, "I'm going up to Park City." And she said, "Oh, your kind likes that place." And I stood there, my mouth was open, and I must have blinked several times, but she didn't apologize, and I didn't call her out on it. But she goes on to share that for the past several years, until just recently, she lived in the South, and she was a white woman with a black man, and the struggles they had. And what I realized is she recognized me, and it was her way of saying, "I recognize you." And she didn't mean it to be offensive, but I could have easily been very offended because, yes, my kind does like Park City, but it's not your kind that can call me out on it.
Yeah.
But you're right. And for you to have seen the intended warmth of her statement.
Yes.
It's highly of you as well. And to not always have that barrier up. Yeah. I think we do. We have to, the arrows have to rebound or be absorbed.
That's it. And I've been out so damn long now, I just always assume everybody knows. I mean, it's not a surprise. if they think I'm marrying a woman, that's definitely the surprise. Not that there's anything wrong with women. It's just not my lane in this life.
Yeah, I was going to say your logo's not helping. You're hiding in plain sight, Dan.
That is very true, Rob.
I can see it on the screen. It's right above. It's hovering in the corner above Donna.
So, a curiosity question. So, you're on book 3 and almost finished with it. How long did it take you to write The Case of the Missing Maid? And then also the second one, because I assume with the first one, and I do know from the acknowledgments, there was a lot of research to be done. So how long did it take on the second one?
The second one took about 10 months.
Okay.
Yeah, and the third one is taking it's going to take about 10 months.
Okay.
I swear that historicals, because, I wrote the 2 contemporary books. First off, they were a little shorter, about 10,000 words shorter, but it's not that $10,000 page, it's 10,000 word page differential that accounts for twice the time. It's the research, it's things like, oh, I've got her walking down the sidewalk. I want the reader to know what that sounds like. So are her footsteps on cement, on timber, or on dirt?
Or cobblestone.
Damn.
Yeah.
Cobblestone.
Fast forward an hour and I'm like, it's like, it's that kind of stuff. A historical, you can really assume, you can assume very little, like a hamburger. Did they have hamburgers? Did they call them hamburgers?
Yeah.
What did a hamburger cost? So it's like that stuff is I constantly am running into like stops where I got to go figure it out.
Well, and to give the audience, sorry, Donna, to give the audience a little bit of a sample. So in this book, Harriet eats a sandwich that is 15 cents. And of course, the first thing that comes to my mind is, oh, wow, how cheap is that? Yet Harriet says, I can do it today, but I can't do it every day this week because I just can't afford it.
Right.
And it's like, oh, shucks. Oh, because we have a different frame of reference. I remember the first car my parents bought was only $3,000 and some dollars. Fast forward to today, you're only going to buy a clunker that's $3,000. So
right. And again, one of those things about like how far we've come and yet to go. At some point in the book, right? It's early on because she's all excited because she's earning 50% more as a detective, right, than she did as a bookkeeper at the grain elevators, at the Rock Island grain elevators. But Theodore Prescott didn't intend to hire a woman. She just showed up, and that's in the book. But given that she's a woman, I only have to pay her half what I was going to pay this guy. Right. So it's like, and still, it's like that sandwich. It's, because she's just like, I'm also, I got to buy groceries for my brother, and he's like 16 and eats like a horse, even though he's skinny, just watch that boy eat. And I got to pay for my own stuff. And I inherited my parents' apartment, but, I got to pay for that.
Absolutely.
So, she's cash strapped, so she's making more, but she's still making half what he was going to pay a man. There you go. It's like,
and that's what I love about your book is the education with the entertainment. I have always loved reading Phoebe Atwood Taylor. She wrote in the 1930s and 40s, talks about gas rationing, sugar rationing. Never in my history books did I read that level of detail and what it was like on a day-to-day basis to live in that period. Your book gives that kind of insights into what it was like living in America in that period. I love education with my entertainment. You did a great job. Your research was wonderful.
I agree 100%.
Try. It is tricky. I mean, like a lot of times I had to give myself grace for being, it's, hey, this is fiction, because how much did she really make as a detective? There weren't any. I mean, there was, everybody, or a lot of people understandably and rightly so, reference Kate Warren, who was the first detective with the Pinkerton Agency. That was like 3 decades before Harriet. And then they disbanded the Women's Detective Bureau at Pinkerton's, right? So how much would she get paid? I reference it in Author's Note. I triangulate, I'll look at jobs that women did have outside the workplace and what those paid, and then just tried to find, it's like book marketing. I tried to find a comp. It's like, okay, maybe Prescott would pay her what a school teacher might get paid. Maybe, more hazardous work, but would he care? I don't know.
Slightly more than the secretary.
Not precise.
Yeah, precisely. So once again, the book is The Case of the Missing Maid. It's by Rob Osler. Rob, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. Make it easy. robosler.com.
It doesn't get much easier than that. Thank
All
you so much.
Handles are there.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much for being here. And Donna, thank you for co-hosting with me. It was a great deal of pleasure.
Absolutely. I love it. You guys.
Thank you, friend.
Take care.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.